What if everything you know about Christianity is only part of the truth? Hidden in the caves of Egypt are texts that the Church has concealed for 17 centuries. Gospels, written by the apostles, but declared heresy. Teachings of Christ that overturn the conventional understanding of salvation. Secret knowledge, passed down through the centuries in closed brotherhoods. Today, we will uncover the forbidden pages of history and learn why the Vatican still keeps these texts from the general public. Get ready for a journey into a world where good and evil are reversed, and truth is hidden behind symbols and codes. If you are intrigued by the secret teachings of Christ, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Now here's a question for discussion in the comments. Do you think the Church had the right to exclude Gnostic texts from the Bible? Or was it a cover-up of the true teachings? Share your opinion. In December 1945, Egyptian farmer Muhammad Ali al-Samam was digging at the foot of Mount Jebel al-Tarif, near the village of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. He was looking for Seba, soft, fertile soil for fertilizing fields. His hoe suddenly hit something hard. Clearing away the sand, Muhammad discovered a large red clay jug sealed with wax. At first, he hesitated, not daring to break the vessel. Superstition told him that a genie might be hiding inside, but greed got the better of him. What if there was gold in there? With one blow of a stone, Muhammad broke the jug. Instead of treasure, inside were 13 leather-bound volumes filled with incomprehensible Coptic script. Disappointed, the farmer took some of the books home, where his mother used several pages as kindling for the stove. Fortunately, the remaining manuscripts were sold on the black market for antiques, from where they found their way into the hands of scholars. What Muhammad Ali accidentally dug up turned out to be one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. A library of Gnostic texts that had been hidden for almost 17 centuries. These texts were buried around 380 AD, probably by monks from the nearby monastery of Saint Pachomius. At that time, the Christian Church was actively fighting heresy, destroying all writings that did not conform to the established doctrine. The monks hid the forbidden books in a jar, sealed it, and buried it in a cave, hoping to preserve the knowledge for future generations. They could not have imagined that their hiding place would remain untouched for more than 1,500 years, surviving the fall of empires, the Crusades, and the change of civilizations. When the contents of the codices were finally translated and studied, scholars were amazed. They found texts describing a completely different Christianity, mystical, esoteric, filled with the secret revelations of Jesus Christ. There were no familiar gospel stories about miracles and sermons. Instead, the manuscripts contained dialogues between the resurrected Christ and his disciples, in which the Savior revealed the profound mysteries of the universe, the nature of the soul, and the path to spiritual liberation. This was knowledge intended not for the masses, but for the chosen ones, those who were ready to penetrate the veil of the material world. Among the texts found were the Gospel of Thomas, containing 114 secret sayings of Jesus, the Gospel of Philip, with its profound mystical reflections, the apocrypha of John, revealing Gnostic cosmology, and many other works whose titles seemed heretical to modern Christians. These books were never included in the official canon of the New Testament. Moreover, the early Christian fathers of the Church fought fiercely against their dissemination, declaring the teachings they contained to be dangerous heresies. But why was the Church so afraid of these texts? What was so threatening to official doctrine? The Nag Hammadi Library opened a window for researchers into the world of early Christianity, which was much more diverse and complex than previously thought. It turned out that in the first centuries of the Christian religion, there were many different movements and schools, each with its own understanding of Christ's teachings. The Gnostics who created these texts believed that salvation was achieved not through blind faith and obedience to church dogma, but through personal mystical knowledge, gnosis. They claimed that Jesus imparted secret truths to his chosen disciples, which the Church subsequently concealed from the people in order to maintain control over the faithful. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts represented more than just an alternative version of Christianity. They challenged the very foundations of church authority, claiming that every person could attain direct knowledge of God without the mediation of priests and hierarchy. It was a revolutionary statement that undermined the entire structure of organized religion. Unsurprisingly, these texts were declared heretical and methodically destroyed over the centuries. The discovery in the Egyptian desert gave back to the world the voices of those whom the Church had tried to silence forever. But what exactly did these forbidden teachings contain? And why do they still cause controversy among theologians and historians? The word apocrypha comes from the Greek apokryphos, which means hidden or secret. In the early Christian era, this term referred to texts containing secret knowledge intended for the initiated. However, over time, the meaning of the word changed. Church authorities began to call all writings that were not included in the official biblical canon and were considered inauthentic or heretical, apocryphal. Today we have a whole library of such texts, Gospels, epistles, revelations, and treatises that claim to convey the true teachings of Christ, but were excluded from the Holy Scriptures for various reasons. Apocryphal Gospels differ significantly from the canonical ones, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. While the texts recognized by the Church focus on Jesus' earthly life, his miracles, parables, and crucifixion, the Apocrypha often describe what happened before Christ's birth or after his resurrection. Many of them are collections of sayings and dialogues devoid of narrative structure. In them, Jesus appears not so much as a historical preacher, but as a mystical teacher revealing cosmic secrets to his chosen disciples. These texts are written in a language of symbols and metaphors that requires deep esoteric interpretation. Why were some texts accepted by the Church and others rejected? The process of forming the biblical canon took several centuries and was far from simple. In the early centuries of Christianity, there were many communities, each with its own sacred writings. Some groups revered the Gospel of Thomas, others the Gospel of Peter, and still others the Gospel of the Hebrews. Disputes over which books were considered divinely inspired and which were false raged with extraordinary ferocity. The criteria for selection were the age of the text, its authorship, its conformity to apostolic tradition, and, most importantly, the orthodoxy of its content. Texts that deviated too much from the emerging church doctrine were declared forgeries, even if they were indeed ancient. Gnostic writings were subject to particularly harsh criticism. Gnosticism was a complex religious and philosophical movement that flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Gnostics believed that the material world was created not by the true God, but by some imperfect deity, the demiurge. According to their teachings, the human soul is a particle of divine light imprisoned in the dungeon of matter. Salvation is achieved through gnosis, direct mystical knowledge of one's true divine nature. In the Gnostic interpretation, Christ comes not to atone for the sins of humanity with his blood, but to awaken in people the memory of their heavenly origin and show them the way to liberation. This vision sharply contradicted the emerging Orthodox doctrine. Church hierarchs insisted on the literal resurrection of the flesh, on the unity of the Creator of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, and on the necessity of church mediation for salvation. Gnostics, on the other hand, claimed that true salvation was an inner transformation of consciousness that required neither priests, rituals, nor blind faith. Moreover, many Gnostic texts contained radical ideas about the equality of men and women in spiritual knowledge, about the multiplicity of paths to truth, and about the symbolic rather than literal interpretation of the Scriptures. All of this posed a threat to centralized church authority. The Church Fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Irenaeus of Lyons, Tertullian, and Hippolytus of Rome, wrote numerous treatises against Gnostic heresies. They portrayed Gnostics as dangerous false teachers who distorted true Christianity. In these polemical writings, Gnostic ideas were presented in a distorted and grotesque form, which shaped the negative perception of these teachings for centuries to come. When Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, systematic persecution of heretics began. Gnostic communities were destroyed, their temples demolished, and their books burned. It seemed that alternative versions of Christianity had been wiped off the face of the earth forever. However, knowledge cannot be completely destroyed. Some texts survived in the quotations of critics. Others were hidden and forgotten, and still others were passed down in the oral tradition of secret societies. The apocrypha continued to exist underground, exerting a hidden influence on various mystical movements of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The Cathars, Bogomils, and Albigensians. All these heretical movements drew inspiration from Gnostic ideas to one degree or another, even though the texts themselves were inaccessible to them. The Inquisition ruthlessly persecuted the bearers of alternative knowledge, seeing it as a mortal threat to the Church's monopoly on truth. But it proved impossible to completely eradicate man's thirst for secret knowledge. And when the apocryphal texts were rediscovered in the 20th century, they revealed to the modern world the forgotten dimensions of early Christianity, calling into question many established ideas about the origin and nature of the Christian religion. What exactly did these forbidden Gospels contain? And what secrets of Christ did they reveal? Among the texts discovered in Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Thomas occupies a special place, one of the most intriguing and mysterious documents of early Christianity. Unlike the canonical Gospels, this text does not contain a narrative of Jesus' life. Instead, it is a collection of 114 logia, or sayings of Christ, each of which begins with the formula, "Jesus said." These statements are concise, enigmatic, and often contradict traditional Christian teachings. They require not blind faith, but deep reflection and inner insight to understand their hidden meaning. The text itself begins with a provocative statement. These are the secret words that Jesus, the living, said, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. And he said, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these words will not taste death." Already in this introduction, the central idea of Gnosticism is laid out: salvation through knowledge. It is not faith in the crucifixion and resurrection, nor observance of commandments and rituals, but understanding the secret meaning of Christ's teachings that gives a person immortality. This is radically different from Orthodox Christianity, where salvation comes through God's grace and the atoning sacrifice of Jesus. In the Gospel of Thomas, each person must discover the divine truth within themselves. Many of the sayings in this Gospel sound paradoxical and mysterious. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have it within you, what you do not have within you will kill you, says Jesus. What do these words mean? Gnostics interpreted them as a reference to the divine spark contained in every human soul. Those who realize their true spiritual nature and manifest it will attain salvation. Those who remain ignorant of their divine essence will remain forever captive to the material world. This teaching of self-knowledge as the path to liberation contrasts sharply with the Church doctrine of the sinfulness of human nature and the need for external redemption. Some of the logia in the Gospel of Thomas have parallels in the canonical Gospels, but even familiar parables take on a different tone here. For example, the parable of the sower is shorter and lacks the detailed interpretations found in Matthew and Mark. This corresponds to the Gnostic principle. Truth must be grasped independently, not received ready-made from an authority. Other sayings are completely unique and do not appear in the canon. The kingdom of the Father is like a woman carrying a jug full of flour. As she walked along the road far from home, the handle of the pitcher broke, and the flour spilled out onto the road behind her. She did not know or notice the misfortune. When she came home, she set down the pitcher and found it empty. What does this parable mean? Various interpretations have been offered over decades of research. Particularly noteworthy are the sayings about the nature of the kingdom of God. In the canonical Gospels, the kingdom is often described as a future event that will come after the second coming of Christ. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "The kingdom of the Father is spread abroad upon the earth, and men see it not." The disciples ask, "When will the kingdom come?" Jesus replies, "It will not come when they expect it." They will not say, "Here it is," or "There it is," but the kingdom of the Father is spread throughout the earth, and people do not see it. This mystical understanding of the kingdom as a reality present here and now, hidden from ordinary perception, is a key element of Gnostic teaching. Salvation is not postponed to the future. It is available immediately through a change of consciousness. The church authorities had serious reasons for rejecting the Gospel of Thomas. First, it was attributed to the Apostle Thomas, but most scholars date its composition to the middle of the 2nd century, too late for authentic authorship. Second, and more importantly, the content of the text contradicted the emerging orthodoxy. The Gospel makes no mention of the crucifixion or resurrection of Christ, central events of the Christian faith. It does not speak of original sin, atonement, or the Last Judgment. Instead, the text focuses on Gnostic enlightenment, on knowing one's true nature as the key to liberation. Such teaching undermined the need for church hierarchy and sacraments, making every person a potential possessor of direct knowledge of God. There is a theory that the Gospel of Thomas may have been one of the earliest collections of Jesus' sayings, possibly even preceding the canonical Gospels. Some researchers believe that the authors of Matthew and Luke may have used a source similar to the Gospel of Thomas for their texts. If this is the case, then what we have before us is not a later heretical forgery, but the authentic voice of the earliest followers of Christ, preserving his teaching in its original form before it was reworked by the Church. This hypothesis remains controversial, but it forces us to reconsider established ideas about the development of Christian tradition. Perhaps a mystical and esoteric understanding of Jesus' teachings existed from the very beginning, parallel to the more institutional form of religion. And this secret dimension of Christianity never completely disappeared, continuing to exist in the hidden traditions of the initiated. But how exactly was this secret knowledge transmitted through centuries of persecution? In 1945, in addition to the Nag Hammadi library, the world learned of another amazing text, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. This document was actually discovered much earlier, in 1896 in Cairo, but its significance was only realized decades later. The manuscript is a Coptic translation of the Greek original, dating from the 2nd century AD. Unfortunately, only part of the text has survived. The first 6 pages and 4 pages from the middle are missing. Nevertheless, what remains is deeply impressive and challenges traditional ideas about the role of women in early Christianity. The text begins with a dialogue between the risen Christ and his disciples. Jesus instructs them not to establish any rules other than those he has given, and not to create lawmakers. After this, the Savior leaves his disciples, and they remain in confusion and sorrow. Peter says, "If the Savior deemed her worthy, who are we to reject her?" He is referring to Mary Magdalene, who, according to the text, received special revelations from Christ that were not available to the other apostles. Mary begins to share the secret teaching that Jesus gave her in private. She describes the ascent of the soul through various cosmic spheres guarded by archons, hostile spiritual forces that try to keep the soul in material captivity. Mary's teaching is distinctly Gnostic in nature. She explains that the soul must overcome 7 levels of obstacles on its way to the true divine home. Each level is guarded by an authority that demands accountability from the soul and tries to stop its ascent. The soul defeats these guardians not by force, but by knowledge, gnosis. It declares its true nature, rejects the claims of false powers, and continues its ascent. This mystical description of the spiritual journey presents salvation not as an external event granted by grace, but as an internal process of awareness and overcoming the illusions of the material world. However, not all disciples accept Mary's words. Andrew expresses doubt. "Tell me, what do you think of what she said? As for me, I do not believe that the Savior said this, for these teachings are different thoughts." Peter reacts even more sharply. Did he really talk to a woman in secret from us, and not openly? Are we really supposed to turn to her and listen to everything she says? Did he prefer her to us? These words reflect not only personal resentment, but also real disputes in early Christian communities about the role of women in the transmission of sacred knowledge. The Gospel shows the conflict between those who recognized the spiritual equality of the sexes and those who insisted on male primacy. Mary responds with tears. "My brother, Peter, what do you think? Do you think I made this up in my heart, or that I am lying about the Savior?" Levi, another disciple, comes to Mary's defense. "Peter, you are always angry. Now I see that you are competing with a woman as adversaries. But if the Savior deemed her worthy, who are you to reject her?" Of course, the Savior knew her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. These words point to Mary's special closeness to Jesus, and to the fact that she was not just a follower, but a chosen disciple who received secret revelations. For the official church, which formed its hierarchy on the basis of male priesthood and apostolic succession through Peter, the Gospel of Mary presented a serious problem. The text unequivocally asserted that a woman could be the bearer of higher spiritual knowledge, surpassing the understanding of the male apostles. Moreover, it portrayed Peter, the rock on which Christ promised to build his church, as a limited and angry man, incapable of accepting the truth. Recognizing such a text would have undermined the entire patriarchal structure of church authority. Not surprisingly, the Gospel of Mary was declared apocryphal and excluded from the canon. Nevertheless, the text was preserved in Gnostic communities, where women played an active role as prophetesses, teachers, and even presiders at sacred gatherings. Orthodox church fathers fiercely criticized this practice. Tertullian wrote indignantly, "These heretical women, how insolent they are! They dare to teach, argue, perform exorcisms, promise healings, and perhaps even baptize." For him and his like-minded colleagues, the participation of women in sacred rituals was a sign of heresy. The Gospel of Mary justified precisely this practice, asserting that spiritual knowledge and authority do not depend on gender. But were there other texts that also challenged official doctrine, presenting an alternative cosmology and a different understanding of the figure of Christ himself? In 2006, the world was shaken by the publication of the Gospel of Judas, a text that overturned the traditional understanding of the most famous traitor in history. This Coptic manuscript, dating from the 3rd or 4th century AD, was discovered in Egypt in the 1970s, but for many years remained in the hands of private collectors and antique dealers. During this time, the document was seriously damaged. The pages were destroyed, and the text became illegible. Only when the manuscript finally came into the hands of scientists did the painstaking work of restoring and translating it begin. The result exceeded all expectations. According to the Gospel of Judas, Iscariot was not a pathetic traitor driven by greed or malice. On the contrary, he was the only disciple who truly understood Christ's teachings. The text begins with the words, "The secret word of revelation that Jesus spoke in conversation with Judas Iscariot." Already in this introduction, a radical idea is laid down. Judas received a special revelation that was inaccessible to the other apostles. The dialogues between Jesus and Judas reveal a complex Gnostic cosmology, where the material world was created not by the true God, but by a lesser deity, a demiurge named Sakla, which means fool. Jesus explains to Judas that he did not come to save humanity through a sacrificial death, but to liberate the divine spark imprisoned in his own body. The physical shell is a prison for the true spiritual self of Christ. The death of the body is not a tragedy, but a liberation. And it is Judas who must help Jesus shed this bodily prison by betraying him to the authorities. "You will surpass them all, for you will sacrifice the man who carries me," Jesus says to Judas. Betrayal is transformed from sin into a sacred act, the highest form of service available only to the most enlightened disciple. The other apostles in the Gospel of Judas are portrayed in a negative light. They do not understand the true nature of Christ, worship a false God creator of the material world, and create a church that will become an instrument of this false deity. Jesus sees in a vision how the apostles make sacrifices before the altar, and says, "You priests who serve at the altar in my name, you are mistaken." This is a direct criticism of the emerging church hierarchy and ritual practices. The Gospel asserts that institutional Christianity, which will be built on apostolic succession, is a false path leading not to the true God, but to the demiurge. Such a radical reappraisal of the figure of Judas and criticism of the church explains why this text was declared heretical as early as the 2nd century. Irenaeus of Lyons mentioned the existence of a group of Gnostics who called themselves Cainites and revered all the villains of the Old Testament: Cain, the inhabitants of Sodom, Korah, and of course, Judas. According to these heretics, the biblical villains were actually fighters against the tyranny of the false creator God. Irenaeus wrote with disgust about their Gospel of Judas, which they considered sacred. 2,000 years later, this text was discovered, confirming the words of the ancient critic. The Gospel of Judas opens up the world of 2nd century Gnostic communities, where traditional values were turned upside down: good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, salvation and damnation took on a completely different meaning in a coordinate system where the material world was seen as a prison, and its creator as a usurper. For Gnostics, true spirituality meant rebellion against the cosmic order, a revolt against creation itself. In their understanding, Christ came not to reconcile man with God the Creator, but to open the way to escape from his dominion. And Judas, by helping Christ to free himself from his physical body, performed the greatest act of love and understanding. Modern scholars argue about the authenticity and significance of the Gospel of Judas. Some see it as important evidence of the diversity of early Christianity, while others consider it a late Gnostic fantasy unrelated to the historical Jesus or Judas. However, regardless of its historical authenticity, the text raises profound philosophical and theological questions. What if betrayal was part of a divine plan? What if the traditional church does not truly serve the true God? What if salvation requires not faith in authority, but a radical rethinking of all values? These questions sounded provocative in the 2nd century and remain so today. But Gnostic texts contained not only alternative gospels, there were extensive treatises revealing entire cosmological systems. What secrets of the universe did they reveal? Among the Gnostic texts, Pistis Sophia occupies a special place, an extensive treatise containing mystical dialogues between the risen Christ and his disciples. This text was known to scholars long before the discoveries of the 20th century. The Coptic manuscript of Pistis Sophia has been kept in the British Museum since the 18th century, but its complete translation and study were only completed in the 19th century. The title means faith wisdom and refers to the central character of the cosmic drama, a female spiritual being named Sophia, whose fall and redemption form the core of the narrative. The text describes how the risen Jesus spent 11 years teaching his disciples the mysteries of the universe. After this period, he attained the highest spiritual state and began to reveal the deepest mysteries to them. Christ describes a complex hierarchy of heavenly spheres inhabited by various spiritual beings, eons, archons, powers, and forces. There are 30 eons in total, forming the pleroma, the fullness of divine being. The material world is at the lowest level of this cosmic system, separated from the true divine kingdom by many veils and barriers. The story of Sophia is the dramatic center of the narrative. Sophia, one of the highest eons, was inflamed with the desire to know the incomprehensible Father without the consent of her spiritual spouse. This audacious endeavor led to her fall from the pleroma into the lower realms. There, Sophia found herself in the power of the archons, hostile forces that sought to consume her light. In desperation, she cried out for help, and the Father sent Christ to rescue her. Through a series of repentances, prayers, and hymns, Sophia is gradually cleansed of material defilement and rises back to her true home. This story is an allegory of the journey of the human soul, from its fall into matter to spiritual liberation. The disciples, especially Mary Magdalene, ask Jesus many questions about heavenly mysteries. Christ explains in detail the mechanisms of reincarnation, the nature of sin, and the fate of different types of souls after death. He describes how the archons hinder the ascent of souls by demanding seals and signs from them to pass through each sphere. Only those souls who have received Gnostic knowledge, the mysteries of light, can successfully overcome these obstacles. The rest return to the cycle of incarnations, or fall into the lower realms of punishment. This teaching of salvation through secret knowledge sharply contradicted the Christian doctrine of salvation through faith and grace. Pistis Sophia contains numerous prayers and hymns that were apparently used in the liturgical practice of Gnostic communities. These texts are filled with mystical symbolism of light, veils, treasuries, and eons. The worshipper calls upon various divine powers, asking for protection from the archons and help in spiritual ascension. Some hymns are poetic meditations on themes from the Psalms, but interpreted in a Gnostic key. King David, according to the text, was a great mystic whose psalms contained coded teachings about heavenly mysteries accessible only to the initiated. Of particular interest is the role played by Mary Magdalene in the Pistis Sophia. She asks most of the questions and receives praise from Jesus for her spiritual insight. Christ calls her a pure spirit who has become all light, and promises to reveal all mysteries to her. Peter, on the other hand, complains several times that Mary talks too much and does not give the other disciples a chance to ask questions. Jesus gently rebukes Peter, pointing out that everyone in whom the Spirit of light dwells should freely express their understanding. This dynamic reflects real debates in early Christian communities about the role of women in spiritual teaching. For the official church, Pistis Sophia presented a complex set of problems. The text contained a complex cosmology incompatible with simple monotheism. It described multiple divine emanations, intermediate beings, and hierarchical levels of reality. The doctrine of reincarnation contradicted the Christian doctrine of a single life followed by judgment. The idea that salvation was achieved through secret knowledge undermined the role of the Church as a mediator of grace. Most importantly, the text unequivocally stated that the masses of Christians who had not received the mysteries were doomed to new incarnations in the material world, while only the chosen Gnostics would be able to escape this fate. Such elitism was unacceptable to the Church, which sought to spread its teachings universally. But if Pistis Sophia revealed cosmic secrets, were there texts describing the very origin of this complex system of worlds? The Secret Book of John, also known as the Apocryphon of John, is one of the most philosophically developed Gnostic texts, found in several versions among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. This document claims to contain a revelation given by the risen Christ to the Apostle John. The text begins with John, grieving after the crucifixion, going to the temple and meeting a Pharisee who mocks him. "Where is your teacher now?" Dejected, John goes into the desert, where he has a shining vision of Christ, ready to reveal the greatest mysteries of the universe. Christ begins with a description of the inexpressible, incomprehensible one, the true God who is beyond all understanding. This God did not create the material world. Instead, a series of divine emanations, eons, emerge from him, forming spiritual wholeness. One of these eons is Sophia, wisdom. It is her mistake that leads to the emergence of the material cosmos. Sophia, driven by the desire to create without the consent of her spouse, gives birth to an imperfect being, Yaldabaoth, who has the appearance of a lion with a serpent's body. This being, unaware of the existence of higher powers, declares himself the only God, Yaldabaoth, whom the text also calls Sakla, the fool, and Samael, the blind god, creates the material world as a prison for spiritual sparks that have fallen from the higher spheres. He creates 12 archons, each of whom rules one of the planetary spheres. Then together they create Adam in the image that Yaldabaoth saw in the waters, a reflection of the true heavenly man. However, the Adam they created remains lifeless, until Sophia tricks Yaldabaoth into breathing a particle of divine light into him. Thus, a spark of the highest divine world is enclosed in man, and the archons create a material body as a prison for this spark. The story continues with a reinterpretation of the biblical narrative. Yaldabaoth places Adam in paradise, but forbids him to eat from the tree of knowledge, fearing that man will realize his true spiritual origin. Christ, appearing in the form of an eagle or a serpent, tempts Adam and Eve to taste the forbidden fruit. This is not a fall from grace, but an awakening. The moment when man first realizes his divine nature and understands that Yaldabaoth is not the true God. The angry demiurge expels people from paradise and makes their material bodies even coarser in order to keep their souls more firmly captive in ignorance. Salvation, according to the secret book of John, comes through knowledge of true cosmic history. Christ descends into the material world to remind fallen souls of their heavenly origin. He does not die on the cross. Instead, the text describes how the spiritual Christ leaves Jesus' body before the crucifixion. Those who receive gnosis, knowledge of the falseness of the material world and the truth of the spiritual, will be able to overcome the obstacles of the archons after death and return to the pleroma. The rest will be reincarnated until they attain enlightenment. This radical reinterpretation of the Christian message transformed salvation from an event of grace into a process of knowledge. The secret book of John had a huge influence on Gnostic schools in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The text existed in several editions, which indicates its popularity and active use by various communities. Irenaeus of Lyon specifically refuted the cosmology contained in it, calling it absurd and blasphemous. For the Church Fathers, the claim that the God of the Old Testament was not the true creator, but an ignorant usurper, was unacceptable heresy. However, Gnostics found in this teaching an answer to the agonizing question: why is the world full of suffering if it was created by a good God? Their answer was simple and radical. The world is full of evil because it was not created by a good God. The process of selecting the texts that would be included in the New Testament was long and complicated. In the early centuries of Christianity, there was no consensus on which writings should be considered divinely inspired. Different communities used different Gospels and epistles in their worship. In the East, the Gospel of the Hebrews was popular, while in Syria they read the Diatessaron, a harmonization of the 4 Gospels compiled by Tatian. The Gnostics revered the Gospel of Thomas and other apocrypha. The Ebionites, a Judeo-Christian sect, recognized only the Gospel of Matthew. Marcion's church rejected the entire Old Testament and most of the New Testament, retaining only edited versions of the Gospel of Luke and the epistles of Paul. The need to establish a canon became particularly acute by the end of the 2nd century. The spread of Gnostic and other heretical teachings forced church leaders to define the boundaries of orthodoxy. The first lists of canonical books appeared during this period. The Muratorian fragment, dated around 170, contains a list of books recognized by the Roman Church. It mentions the 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, 13 of Paul's epistles, and several other texts. Interestingly, the fragment also contains warnings against heretical writings, including the works of Valentinus and Marcion. This shows that the formation of the canon was not simply a collection of texts, but an active struggle against alternative versions of Christianity. The criteria for selecting books for the canon were numerous, and not always applied consistently. Apostolic authorship was considered important. Texts attributed to the apostles or their closest disciples were given preference. However, modern scholars know that many canonical books were actually written later and could not have been created by the authors claimed. The epistles to Timothy and Titus, attributed to Paul, were probably written by his followers. The 2nd epistle of Peter, according to most researchers, was written no earlier than the beginning of the 2nd century. Nevertheless, these texts were included in the canon because of their orthodox content and the authority of tradition. The antiquity of the text was also important, but this criterion was applied selectively. The Gospel of Thomas may contain sayings as ancient as the canonical Gospels, but it was rejected because of its Gnostic character. On the other hand, the Apocalypse of John, whose canonicity was long disputed in the East, was ultimately included in the New Testament, although its authorship and date of writing remain controversial. The decisive factor was often conformity with the emerging Orthodox doctrine. Texts that supported the church hierarchy emphasized the unity of the God of the Old and New Testaments, and affirmed the reality of the resurrection of the flesh were given preference. The Council of Nicaea in 325 and subsequent church councils played a key role in the formation of the canon. Although the Council of Nicaea was mainly concerned with Christological disputes and did not establish an official canon, it set the direction for Orthodox doctrine, to which sacred texts had to conform. The final approval of the list of canonical books came later. Athanasius of Alexandria, in his Easter letter of 367, listed 27 books of the New Testament, the same list that is recognized today. The Carthaginian councils of the late 4th century officially approved this canon for the Western Church. What happened to the rejected texts? Many were destroyed as a result of systematic campaigns against heresy. Emperor Constantine, having made Christianity the imperial religion, issued decrees ordering the burning of heretical books. Theodosius and subsequent emperors continued this policy. Possession of forbidden texts was punishable by confiscation of property and exile. Under such conditions, Gnostic writings could only be preserved in hiding places, similar to the one discovered in Nag Hammadi. However, the knowledge contained in these texts did not disappear without a trace. It went underground, passed on through chains of secret disciples and closed brotherhoods. Which societies became the guardians of forbidden knowledge? After the official church declared Gnostic texts heretical and began their systematic destruction, the knowledge did not disappear completely. It went underground, preserved in secret traditions of initiation. The first guardians were the Gnostic communities themselves, which continued to exist on the fringes of the Christian world. The Mandeans, who have survived to this day in Iraq and Iran, trace their tradition back to the disciples of John the Baptist and preserve texts containing Gnostic cosmologies. The Manichaeans, followers of the 3rd century prophet Mani, created a synthetic religion that combined Gnosticism with elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. Their teaching about the struggle between light and darkness echoed Gnostic ideas about spiritual liberation from material bondage. In the Middle Ages, the banner of alternative Christianity was raised by the Cathars of southern France. The Cathar movement flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Cathars, who called themselves good people and good Christians, preached a dualistic doctrine strikingly reminiscent of ancient Gnosticism. They believed that the material world was created by an evil god demiurge, whom they identified with Satan, or the Old Testament God. The true good God dwells in the spiritual realms. Human souls are fallen angels imprisoned in the dungeon of the flesh. Salvation is achieved through asceticism, renunciation of material things, and receiving consolation, a special spiritual baptism practiced by Cathar perfect ones. Did the Cathars have access to ancient Gnostic texts? There is no direct evidence, but the similarity between the teachings is too great to be coincidental. The Catholic Church saw the Cathars as a mortal threat. At the beginning of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Albigensians, as the Cathars were called after the city of Albi. The 20-year war led to the mass extermination of heretics and the destruction of the flourishing culture of Occitania. When the besieged fortress of Béziers was stormed, the papal legate Arnold Amalric allegedly said, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." Thousands of people, both Catholics and Cathars, perished in the fire. The last stronghold of the Cathars, the castle of Montségur, fell in 1244. 200 heretics were burned alive. According to legend, before their execution, the Cathars hid their sacred texts and treasures. Since then, enthusiasts have been searching for the Cathar treasure, which may have included ancient Gnostic manuscripts. The Knights Templar, a knightly order of crusaders, are also associated with the transmission of secret knowledge. Founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, the order quickly accumulated enormous wealth and political influence. The Templars spent years in the East, where they had contact with various religious groups, including Islamic Sufi mystics and Eastern Christians. There are theories that they discovered ancient manuscripts in Jerusalem, containing alternative versions of Christian history. When King Philip IV of France decided to destroy the order and confiscate its wealth, the Templars were accused of heresy. Among the charges were worship of the idol Baphomet and renunciation of Christ. Under torture, the knights confessed to various sins, although these confessions are questionable. The last Grand Master of the order, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. According to legend, before his death, he cursed the king and the pope, predicting their imminent demise. After the defeat of the Templars, their traditions may have been preserved in other secret societies. Freemasonry, which emerged in the 17th century, claims to be the successor to medieval building guilds, but includes elements of esoteric philosophy, some of which resemble Gnostic ideas. Masonic rituals speak of the search for light, liberation from the darkness of ignorance, and the secret knowledge of ancient mysteries. Although a direct connection with Gnosticism is debatable, the symbolic language of Freemasonry contains themes of spiritual enlightenment and transformation, characteristic of esoteric traditions. The Rosicrucians, who appeared in the early 17th century, openly claimed to possess the secret wisdom of the ancients. Their manifestos promised the reform of all humanity through the dissemination of secret knowledge. In the 19th and 20th centuries, interest in Gnosticism was revived in the Theosophical movement, anthroposophy, and other esoteric schools. The Vatican secret archives are shrouded in legends and conspiracy theories. Officially called Apostolica Vaticana, these archives contain documents accumulated over more than 1,000 years of Catholic Church history. The collection occupies 85 kilometers of shelves and includes millions of pages of texts dating back to the Middle Ages. For a long time, access to the archives was strictly limited. It was not until 1881 that Pope Leo XIII opened them to qualified researchers, albeit with significant restrictions. Until the 1930s, it was only possible to study documents dating back to 1853. Gradually, the time frame was expanded, but many materials remain closed. What exactly is stored in these archives? Officially, they contain correspondence between popes and rulers and church hierarchs. minutes of councils, bulls and decrees, documents of the Inquisition, and diplomatic papers. Among the well-known treasures are Martin Luther's letter to the Pope, English King Henry VIII's petition for divorce, the minutes of Galileo's trial, and documents about the Knights Templar. However, conspiracy theorists are convinced that more explosive materials are hidden in the depths of the vaults. Perhaps there are ancient Gospels that were not included in the canon, manuscripts that compromise the official history of the Church, and evidence of events that the Vatican would prefer to hide. There is a theory that the Vatican possesses copies of many Gnostic texts that were destroyed in the early centuries of Christianity. The Church Fathers, who fought against heresy, must have known the content of the teachings they refuted. Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Epiphanius quoted Gnostic texts in detail in their polemical writings. Where did they get these quotations? Obviously, they had access to the original manuscripts. Perhaps some of these texts were preserved in church libraries, even when public possession of them was punishable as heresy. Why destroy the enemy's knowledge when it can be preserved for study and more effective combat? This logic explains why the Church might have secretly preserved the apocrypha. Another theory is related to discoveries made during the Crusades. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, they gained access to libraries and archives that had been untouched for centuries. The Templars, based on the Temple Mount, may have discovered manuscripts hidden under the ruins. According to one version, they found documents that questioned the divinity of Christ or revealed an alternative history of his life. These findings were smuggled to Europe and eventually fell into the hands of the church authorities. Faced with texts that were potentially destructive to the faith, the Vatican decided to hide them forever. There is no evidence for this theory, but it persists in esoteric circles. In the 20th century, interest in secret archives intensified after the publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi library. If such important texts were kept in hiding places in Egypt and Qumran, what might be stored in the Vatican? Some researchers demanded that the archives be opened completely, claiming that the Church was hiding information that belonged to all of humanity. The Vatican responded that the archives were gradually being opened, but that the cataloging process was enormous and time-consuming. In addition, some documents contain information that violates privacy or diplomatic secrecy and cannot be made public under secular law. In 2019, Pope Francis announced the opening of the archives of the Pontificate of Pius XII, including the years of World War II. This decision aroused great interest among historians, especially in the context of the Vatican's role during the Holocaust. However, documents from earlier periods remain partially closed. Will all materials ever be made public? Are there texts in the Vatican that the Church will never allow to be made available to the general public? These questions continue to preoccupy researchers. If the apocrypha are indeed stored in secret libraries, what symbols and codes do they contain? Gnostic texts are written in a language of symbols that requires a special key to decipher. This is not a coincidence, but a deliberate strategy to conceal sacred knowledge from the uninitiated. The Gnostics themselves explained this approach with the words of Christ from the canonical Gospels. "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of God. But to the rest it is given in parables, so that they may see but not perceive, and hear but not understand." Esoteric teaching required not just reading the text, but an inner enlightenment that allowed one to penetrate the veil of literal meaning. Symbols of light and darkness, above and below, inner and outer, permeate every page of Gnostic writings. The central symbol is light, as a metaphor for divine knowledge and true reality. The material world is described as darkness or shadow, devoid of true being. The human soul is a spark of light, imprisoned in the dungeon of matter. Salvation is understood as the awakening of this spark and its return to the source of light. Christ in Gnostic texts is often called the light or the illuminator, the one who brings enlightenment to the darkness of ignorance. This metaphor permeates all mystical literature from antiquity to the present day. Interestingly, Similar symbolism is found in various religious traditions, from Zoroastrian dualism of light and darkness to the Buddhist concept of enlightenment. Numerical symbolism plays an important role in esoteric texts. 7 is the number of planetary spheres through which the ascending soul must pass. Each sphere is ruled by an archon, each with its own name and symbol. 12 is the number of apostles, but also the number of zodiac signs and the first archons created by the demiurge. 30 is the number of eons in the pleroma, the fullness of divine being. 365 is the number of days in a year, but also the numerical value of the name Abraxas, one of the Gnostic deities symbolizing the fullness of time and eternity. Gnostics used gematria, a system in which each letter corresponds to a numerical value, allowing them to find hidden connections between words and names. In Gnostic symbolism, the serpent takes on a positive meaning, opposite to its role in Orthodox Christianity. Some Gnostic sects, known as Ophites or Nassenes, from the Hebrew Nahash, serpent, revered the serpent as the liberator of humanity. It was the serpent in paradise who offered Adam and Eve a taste of the tree of knowledge, opening their eyes to the true nature of the demiurge. The serpent symbolized wisdom, gnosis, and spiritual awakening. In some texts, Christ is identified with the bronze serpent that Moses raised in the desert, a symbol of healing and salvation through contemplation of divine truth. The androgyny of the divine principle is another important Gnostic symbol. Many eons in the pleroma exist as pairs, syzygies, male and female principles in unity. The original one is sometimes described as father-mother, containing both principles. Sophia, the female embodiment of wisdom, plays a central role in the cosmic drama. This view contrasts sharply with the patriarchal image of God in Orthodox Christianity. Gnostics saw androgyny as a symbol of original perfection, which was disrupted by the division into opposites. Spiritual ascent involved the restoration of this original unity. The cross takes on an unexpected interpretation in Gnostic texts. It symbolizes not sacrifice and atonement, but a cosmic structure, the intersection of the spiritual and material dimensions. The horizontal line represents the material world, the vertical line the path of spiritual ascent. The center of the cross is the point where the two worlds meet, the place of transformation and transition. Some texts speak of the cross of light, invisible to the uninitiated, which represents the true nature of Christ, not a suffering man, but a triumphant spiritual teacher. The physical crucifixion was an illusion, a shadow of reality, while the true spiritual Christ remained unaffected by material events. Mirrors and reflections are common metaphors in Gnostic texts. The material world is described as a distorted reflection of true spiritual reality. What people take for authentic existence is in fact only a shadow, a projection of the higher world. The demiurge created the cosmos after seeing his reflection in the waters of chaos, and not understanding that he was seeing only an image of higher reality. Man must learn to look through the mirror of matter to see the true reality behind it. This symbolism echoes the famous words of the Apostle Paul. Now we see as through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. The discoveries of the 20th century were not limited to the Nag Hammadi library. In 1945–1947, Bedouin shepherds discovered scrolls dating from the last centuries BC and the 1st century AD in caves near the Dead Sea. Although the Dead Sea Scrolls mainly contain Jewish texts from the Essene community, some fragments shed light on the religious environment in which Christianity arose. The Essenes practiced asceticism, communal property, and ritual ablutions, features reminiscent of descriptions of early Christian communities. There are hypotheses that John the Baptist, or even Jesus himself, may have had contact with this sect. In 2006, as already mentioned, the text of the Gospel of Judas was published. But this is not the only important discovery of recent decades. In the 1950s, Fragments of the Gospel of Peter were discovered in Egypt, describing the resurrection of Christ in unusual detail. According to this text, 3 figures emerged from the tomb. 2 supported the third, and the heads of the 2 reached the sky, while the head of the one being led surpassed the heavens. A cross followed them. A voice from heaven asked, "Have you proclaimed it to the dead?" And the cross replied, "Yes." This fantastic story explains why the text was not included in the canon, but it shows how diverse early Christian beliefs were. In 1907, papyrus fragments containing sayings attributed to Jesus were found in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. It was only decades later that scholars realized that these were parts of the Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas. The discovery proved that the text was originally written in Greek in the 2nd century or even earlier, and then translated into Coptic. This strengthened the arguments of those who saw the Gospel of Thomas as one of the early sources of Christian tradition. Ongoing archaeological work in Egypt regularly yields new fragments of ancient texts, although no complete codices similar to the Nag Hammadi finds have been discovered. In 2012, reports emerged of a credit card-sized papyrus fragment in which Jesus mentions, "My wife." The text, called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, caused a huge stir. If authentic, it could testify to the existence of early Christian traditions that recognized Christ's marriage. However, after careful examination, most scholars concluded that the fragment was a modern forgery. Nevertheless, the episode showed how great the public interest is in alternative versions of the story of Jesus, and how easily forgeries can be presented as sensational discoveries. The digital age has opened up new opportunities for studying ancient texts. Multispectral imaging technologies allow us to read faded or damaged manuscripts that are inaccessible to the naked eye. Using these methods, scientists have restored texts on palimpsests, parchments where the old text has been scraped off and a new one written on top. More ancient texts, including previously unknown works, are sometimes found under prayer books and liturgical books. In 2004, Archimedes' palimpsest was restored in this way. But similar technology is also applied to religious texts, revealing new fragments of early Christian literature. The internet and the digitization of manuscripts have made ancient texts accessible to researchers around the world. Projects such as the Digital Library of the Middle East provide online access to thousands of manuscripts. This democratizes the study of apocrypha, allowing independent researchers to work with materials that previously required trips to museums and special permits. However, it also facilitates the spread of pseudoscientific theories and hoaxes. It is becoming increasingly difficult for the general public to distinguish genuine science from sensationalism. Nevertheless, discoveries continue, and each new discovery has the potential to change our understanding of early Christianity. How have these ancient texts influenced modern esoteric movements? Gnostic ideas never completely disappeared from Western spiritual tradition. Even during periods of severe persecution, they continued to exist in hidden forms, influencing various mystical and occult movements. Medieval alchemy, which outwardly appeared to be a search for a way to turn metals into gold, was at a deeper level a spiritual practice of transformation. Alchemists spoke of transforming the lead of the soul into the gold of the spirit, of liberating the divine spark from its material prison. Their symbolic language echoed Gnostic terminology of light and darkness, above and below, gross and subtle. The Renaissance brought a revival of interest in ancient wisdom and Hermetic texts. Marsilio Ficino translated into Latin the Hermetic Corpus, a collection of texts attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus. These works, created in the early centuries of our era in Hellenistic Egypt, contained a mixture of Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, and Gnostic ideas. Renaissance magicians and philosophers, such as Giordano Bruno and Pico della Mirandola, drew from this source concepts of spiritual ascent, magic as the knowledge of the hidden laws of nature, and man as a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. The Inquisition burned Bruno in 1600, partly for his heretical views, which were rooted in the Gnostic tradition. In the 17th century, the Rosicrucian movement appeared, proclaiming the existence of a secret brotherhood possessing ancient wisdom. The Rosicrucian manifestos promised to reform the whole world through the dissemination of secret knowledge. They spoke of the tomb of the order's founder, Christian Rosenkreuz, where sacred texts and symbols were kept. Although the historicity of Rosenkreuz himself is questionable, the ideas of the movement had a profound influence on European esotericism. The Rosicrucians preached the possibility of spiritual transformation through mystical knowledge, the union of science and religion, and the existence of a hidden tradition of initiates, all themes that resonate with the Gnostic heritage. The 19th century was a time of occult revival. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Blavatsky in 1875, offered a synthesis of Eastern and Western esotericism. Blavatsky claimed to receive teachings from the Mahatmas, enlightened masters who preserved ancient knowledge. Her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, contains a complex cosmology with multiple planes of existence, spiritual hierarchies, and a concept of the evolution of consciousness through a chain of incarnations. Although Blavatsky drew mainly from Hindu and Buddhist sources, her system has structural parallels with Gnostic cosmologies. The idea that the material world is the lowest level of reality, and that true spirituality requires ascension through higher planes, is unmistakably Gnostic. In the 20th century, Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung turned to Gnostic texts as a source of understanding the psyche. Jung saw in Gnostic myths a symbolic expression of the archetypal processes of individuation, the journey to wholeness through the integration of the unconscious. Sophia represented the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche. The demiurge symbolized the ego, which mistakenly takes itself for the highest reality. The pleroma corresponded to the collective unconscious, the source of all archetypes. Jung even wrote a text entitled 7 Instructions to the Dead, stylized as a Gnostic treatise, in which he presented his ideas in symbolic form. His work made Gnosticism a respectable topic for psychological research. The New Age movement, which flourished in the second half of the 20th century, widely borrowed Gnostic motifs, the ideas that humans are divine beings who have forgotten their true nature, that the material world is an illusion, or a lower level of reality, and that enlightenment is achieved through the expansion of consciousness, all echo ancient Gnosticism. Popular books, such as A Course in Miracles, teach that the world we see is not real, and that true liberation comes through a change in perception. Neil Donald Walsh's Conversations with God proclaims that every person is a part of God that has forgotten this fact. These ideas, although expressed in modern language, essentially reproduce Gnostic doctrine. Contemporary interest in Gnosticism is evident not only in spiritual movements, but also in popular culture. The film The Matrix is based on a Gnostic metaphor. Humanity lives in an illusory reality created by demiurge machines, and only the chosen few can awaken and see the truth. The main character, Neo, goes through an initiation, dies, and is reborn as a savior bearing liberating knowledge. This plot is almost a direct transposition of the Gnostic myth into a science fiction setting. Many other works of art, literature, and cinema draw from the same source, showing that Gnostic themes remain relevant and resonate with the modern consciousness. But how does the scientific community view these ancient texts? The academic community approaches Gnostic texts from the perspective of historical criticism and philological analysis. Most scholars view them not as revelations of divine truth, but as historical documents reflecting the religious beliefs of certain groups in the 2nd to 4th centuries AD. Dating the texts, determining their authorship, identifying sources and influences. These are all standard procedures in biblical studies. According to the scientific consensus, None of the apocryphal texts were written by their claimed authors, the apostles or their closest disciples. The Gospel of Thomas was not written by the Apostle Thomas. The Gospel of Mary was not written by Mary Magdalene. And the apocryphon of John was not written by John the theologian. Pseudepigraphy, attributing a text to an authoritative figure of the past, was a common practice in antiquity. The authors did not consider this to be deception, but rather a way to honor the memory of the teacher whose ideas they were developing. Nevertheless, for modern historical science, this means that the texts must be dated much later than the lives of their alleged authors. Most Gnostic Gospels date from the second half of the 2nd century or the beginning of the 3rd. This makes them valuable testimonies to the religious life of that period, but not reliable sources on the life of the historical Jesus, who lived at the beginning of the 1st century. Critics of conspiracy theories point out that there is no evidence of a deliberate concealment of true Christianity by the Church. The formation of the canon was a natural historical process in which the most widespread and institutionally supported version of the religion prevailed. Gnostic groups were a minority. Their texts were not widely distributed, and it is natural that they were not included in the canon. Moreover, the content of Gnostic texts is indeed sharply different from what was preached by the early Christian communities known from Paul's epistles and the canonical Gospels. The idea of a single creator God, the reality of the resurrection of the flesh, the importance of love and mercy, all of this is already present in the earliest Christian texts and contradicts Gnostic dualism. Defenders of the significance of Gnostic texts argue that early Christianity was much more diverse than Orthodox history presents it. The victorious version wrote history in such a way as to present itself as the only true tradition, and all dissenters as heretics. However, this is a distortion of reality. In the 2nd century, there were many Christian schools with different teachings, and the line between orthodoxy and heresy had not yet been clearly drawn. Some ideas, later declared Gnostic, were present in a wide range of early Christian communities. Elaine Pagels, a renowned scholar of Gnosticism, argues that the selection of certain texts for the canon was a political decision aimed at strengthening the church hierarchy and suppressing alternative voices. Bart Ehrman, a leading New Testament scholar, takes a middle ground. He acknowledges the historical value of apocryphal texts for understanding the diversity of early Christianity, but cautions against uncritically accepting their content. Ehrman shows that many popular claims about the Church hiding the truth are based on a misunderstanding of the historical process. Nevertheless, he agrees that the official history of Christianity has ignored or distorted the role of alternative movements. His works help a wide audience understand the complexity of historical reality without falling into conspiracy theories or apologetics for the official church version. The debate continues in popular literature. Dan Brown's bestseller, The Da Vinci Code, although a work of fiction, presented millions of readers with the idea that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and had descendants, and that the Church concealed this information. The book is based on pseudo-historical theories and free interpretations of Gnostic texts. Scholars unanimously criticize the historical basis of the novel, pointing to numerous factual errors. However, the book's popularity showed that the general public is eager for alternative versions of Christian history and skeptical of official church narratives. This creates a space where serious research is mixed with sensational speculation. Modern science strives for a nuanced approach. Gnostic texts are recognized as important historical sources that shed light on the diversity of early Christianity. They show that in the first centuries, there were radically different interpretations of Christ's teachings. However, this does not mean that Gnosticism represented true or original Christianity. Rather, it was one of many responses to the religious questions of the era, a response that ultimately did not gain widespread acceptance. Studying these texts enriches our understanding of history, but requires a critical approach, and avoidance of both ecclesiastical apologetics and conspiracy theories. Regardless of the historical authenticity of Gnostic texts, their influence on the transformation of the consciousness of those who come into contact with them is undeniable. Many modern readers describe their experience of encountering these writings as a revelation that changes their spiritual perception. The apocrypha offer a radically different perspective on the nature of reality, the place of man in the cosmos, and the path of spiritual development. For those who are disappointed in dogmatic religions or are seeking a more personal spiritual path, Gnostic ideas open up new horizons of understanding. The central message of Gnosticism, that every person carries a divine spark within them, is deeply liberating. This teaching removes dependence on external authorities, church hierarchies, sacred texts, rituals. Salvation is understood not as a gift from outside, but as the awakening of what has always been within. Man is not a sinner in need of redemption, but a God who has forgotten his true nature. This perspective gives a sense of dignity and inner strength. It says that the answers to the deepest questions of existence are to be found not in sacred books or the words of teachers, but in one's own consciousness through meditation, contemplation, and mystical experience. Gnostic criticism of the material world as an imperfect or even evil creation resonates with those who see suffering, injustice, and chaos around them. Traditional theodicy, the justification of a benevolent God in the face of evil in the world, has always been a weak point of monotheistic religions. Gnosticism resolves this problem radically. The world is full of evil because it was not created by the true God. This explanation appeals to people who cannot reconcile the idea of an all-good creator with the reality of a world full of pain. However, critics point out that such a position can lead to a denial of the value of material existence, to escapism, and to a disregard for ethical responsibilities in the physical world. The practical application of Gnostic ideas in modern life takes various forms. Some create Gnostic churches and communities, attempting to revive ancient rituals and practices. The eclectic Gnostic Church, founded in Paris in 1891, continues to exist today. Others integrate Gnostic concepts into their personal spiritual practices, combining them with meditation, yoga, and psychotherapy. Jungian analysis often uses Gnostic symbols to work with the unconscious. Some artists and writers draw inspiration from Gnostic mythology, creating works that explore themes of the illusory nature of reality, the search for the true self, and the struggle against cosmic tyranny. However, interaction with Gnostic texts also carries potential dangers. The elitism inherent in Gnosticism, the division of people into the spiritual, capable of knowledge, and the material, doomed to ignorance, can fuel arrogance and contempt for the unenlightened. Dualism, which opposes spirit and matter, can lead to the denial of the value of the body, nature, and physical existence. Some Gnostic groups in ancient times went to extremes of asceticism, or conversely, libertinism, believing that spiritual people did not care what they did with their bodies. Modern readers should critically reflect on these aspects, not accepting Gnosticism as a ready-made system, but using its insights selectively. Perhaps the main value of Gnostic texts for the modern world lies not in their doctrines, but in what they show. Truth is not monopolized by a single tradition. There have been, and continue to be, multiple paths of spiritual quest, different answers to eternal questions. Familiarity with alternative versions of Christianity broadens the mind, teaches tolerance for dissent, and develops critical thinking skills. In a world where religious intolerance continues to breed conflict, it can be healing to remember that in the early days of Christianity, there were many voices, all claiming to speak the truth. Transforming consciousness through Gnostic texts does not necessarily mean accepting their literal content. It can be an awakening to the understanding that reality is more complex than official doctrines represent, that spiritual seeking is a personal journey that requires the courage to question authority. The ancient Gnostics called for knowing rather than believing. They claimed that truth is accessible through direct experience, not transmitted through a hierarchy of intermediaries. This message remains as revolutionary today as it was 2,000 years ago. Perhaps this is why the Church feared these texts so much, and why they continue to attract those seeking spiritual freedom and personal truth in an age of information and doubt.